Welcome back to Dragon Ball Dissection. I hope you enjoyed our diversion into every single iteration of Plan to Eradicate the Saiyans. This time, though, we return to the main series. If you remember last time we were here, Piccolo couldn't maintain bladder control due to the overwhelming majesty of Shin's mohawk, which made Kuririn the only winner. In fact, the fights up until now have been so underwhelming, I'm pretty sure this is the only time a single manga chapter manages to squeeze in 2 main tournament matches. Well, that's about to change. Match 3 pits Videl against Spopovich. He's the over-muscled bald guy with the M script tattooed on his head that Trunks and Goten mistook themselves for. From that confrontation, it's clear he's not the friendliest of sorts. Even Shin expresses a subtle disdain for him as they pass each other. 2 other competitors, Killa and Jewel, remember him though as a much more pleasant fellow than the drooling, seething brute Videl now squares off against. Videl doesn't hold back, spending the entire first chapter of this fight wailing on the guy. Even before Spopovich finally strikes back, Goku opines that there's something weird about him and that Videl should forfeit. Videl uses her Buku Jutsu to keep herself from falling out of bounds, and her next kick is so ridiculously overpowered that it literally twists Spopovich's entire head around. But he's fine. He simply twists it back into place. Perhaps understandably, he doesn't take kindly to having someone break his neck, and Videl can't even fly away to safety. Instead, he beats the ever-loving crap out of her until the smaller of the M4-headed pair, Yamu, tells him to finish it, and he finally throws her out of the ring. So, this fight. Alright, this fight. Here's the thing. I like to believe Dragon Ball Dissection encourages thinking, and that it attracts viewers who likewise enjoy examining this series. I don't want to tell you what to think or how to think, but simply share my thoughts. Whether you agree or not, I might, at the very least, help you to think in a new way. Dragon Ball is not terribly heady or deep. That's something that can't be overstated. But even in a narrative often as simple as punch evil until it dies, I find the phrase turn off your brain to be appalling. No, I like my brain, I'm using it. But then on occasion we get to stuff like a character design based on racist minstrel imagery or an old man attempting to watch a teenage girl pee. And it's at those moments that I step back and go, do I really have to think today? Can I just have the fun adventures? And it's not because I think discourse on those subjects isn't valid. It's because certain topics elicit passionate responses, often for very good reason. I'm on YouTube where civil discourse goes to die. I get enough bile slung my way for opining that Son Goku is acting out of character, an opinion that has no merit or value to anything that could be deemed important on this spinning blue ball we call home. Suddenly we get to a topic that in a lot of people's eyes reminds them of serious real-world issues. That's scary because it means my opinions carry a lot more consequence. I don't think there's any way around that. This isn't my first rodeo, and I do have a lot to say about this. So let's dive in and hope that no matter how you feel about the content in Dragon Ball chapters 440 to 442, that we can have a calm discussion about it. I'm going to try to be as sensitive about it as I can, while still analyzing it from all the angles I want to. I have received many comments from people who feel that Videl vs. Spopovich contains the most brutal acts of violence in the entire series. I've seen them say that revisiting this material at all is very uncomfortable for them, and I can understand that. This is a sequence of events that includes a large man picking up a teenage girl by the hair and knocking out several of her teeth. That is horrifically violent. But stepping away from the brutality of the act itself and examining it through the various lenses of fiction, our society, and Dragon Ball specifically, I'm going to be honest and say that the topic of this fight and people's reactions to it are things I find infinitely fascinating. I don't particularly care for violence. It's something that we as a society tend to glorify. Fiction tends to glorify it, and when it's not glorifying it, it's treating it as something that's really not that big of a deal. One of my favorite movies of all time, Back to the Future, contains examples of both. A simple comedic response to a conflict is for Marty McFly to punch Biff Tannen in the face. Hijinks ensue. The only way for George McFly to complete his character journey from bullied wimp into confident author is to punch Biff Tannen in the face. Romance ensues. Come to think of it, inflicting head trauma on various members of the Tannen family throughout history seems to be the beginning and end of conflict resolution in these movies. Media certainly led me to believe there'd be more casual fisticuffs in my life than there actually has been. And that's certainly a good thing given that using a closed bony fist to strike a bony head is not often the relatively harmless feat that fiction likes to portray it as. It can cause severe damage not just to the recipient but to the perpetrator. Brains can be damaged and bones can shatter, and yes, that includes teeth. Violence presented in a more stylized way makes it more palatable. Depending on your perspective, minimizing the actual repercussions of violence can make it seem more glamorous or not as big of a deal, and therefore encourage it. Hopefully most of us have enough of a grasp of reality to understand that fiction is not real. We should not imitate the things people do in fiction, and the repercussions of actions in fiction don't necessarily mirror what happens in real life. And with that grasp of reality, in the best case scenarios, you should feel secure that what you enjoy as fiction or fantasy does not necessarily reflect on the behavior you would condone in real life. In the best case scenario. Sadly, that doesn't apply to all people, and there are certainly subtle ways that the media we consume affects how we view the world. But since I haven't brought up Dragon Ball in nearly 400 words, let's tie that back in here. Dragon Ball glorifies violence. It's hard to deny that. There are very few conflicts in Dragon Ball that aren't solved through violence. For the people who frequently scoff at me for analyzing Dragon Ball's story because lols, who watches Dragon Ball for ta story, I have to assume that the violence is literally the only draw. I am someone who has repeatedly said I find the fighting to be the least interesting element of Dragon Ball, but when done well, the fighting is engaging, both visually and how it heightens the impact of the drama. Violence is dramatic. Death is dramatic. Relatable suffering can highlight sacrifice, loss, and the love of companions. I've also said that Dragon Ball's fights tend to lose my interest once they pass the point where I can no longer emotionally connect to the damage being done. So even as someone opposed to violence in real life, I still find Dragon Ball's violence important to the overall experience. Dragon Ball is a fantasy that presents violence in an extraordinarily unrealistic and heightened way, even compared to other fiction. At this point, these people can rip entire planets asunder. They fire destructive beams of mystical energy. Battles can continue for hundreds of pages. Is what happens to Videl, objectively speaking, the most violent act we've seen in this series? No. Dragon Ball features broken bones, limbs being removed, giant holes torn through people's torsos on multiple occasions, and an adult breaking a 5-year-old child's neck. Elderly men have their skulls caved in, countless people are reduced to empty flesh suits, one innocent bystander is even decapitated by having his throat squeezed so hard that it severs his head from the rest of his body. At one point, a teenage girl kicks a man in the head so hard that it turns his neck into the shape of a corkscrew. Oh wait, that's this fight. Yes, even in this scenario, the most violent acts are perpetrated by Videl rather than received by her. And the violence committed against her doesn't even begin to compare to other acts of violence seen in this series. Yet, this fight still leaves quite an impact. Why is that? A long time ago, I asked whether Goku and the others are impervious to Lunch's bullets because they're super strong, or because it's a gag, or both. While Dragon Ball's stylized and hyperpowered martial arts sometimes obscures the effects of real violence, that is further compounded by the fact that Dragon Ball is also a comedy series. Even more so than stylized violence, comedy violence persists through its own rules. It's why I objected to Toriyama throwing in an explanation as to why Mr. Satan survived being attacked by Cell. It doesn't need a literal explanation, it's a joke. Likewise, there can be no definitive answer to the cartoony bullet holes. They exist because they're funny. But Dragon Ball is positioned in a relatively unique way where characters can shrug those things off for real. Dragon Ball exists according to its own rules, but those rules often bend to whatever is narratively expedient, or comedically expedient. And that's where I get into trouble with my philosophy of not turning off my brain, because gags like these require you to suspend your disbelief enough to accept that the rules of this universe include the body horror of a man having his head squeezed off, and a silly guy being propelled several hundred feet into a mountain and suffering no long-term damage. Yet, while these two examples are tonally opposite, they are equally unrealistic, both in service to the needs of the immediate point Toriyama is trying to convey. In the former, the effects of violence are ridiculously overplayed, in the latter, they are ridiculously underplayed. But while the sheer brutality of the former example makes it far more uncomfortable, they are both mitigated by how extreme they are. Videl vs. Spopovich is a fight where the extremes are largely and suddenly removed. After the point where Spopovich gets his head in the game, nearly all the violence is stripped of its exaggerations. There's a little bit of flying, but beyond that, the attacks are largely realistic and imitable. The impact of those attacks are likewise far more realistic than Dragon Ball typically portrays. Dragon Ball has inflicted a broken tooth before, but that case is played for comedy and is fairly quickly either rectified or forgotten. Yamcha's not known for his missing tooth after all. The appeal to vanity is played up while the actual pain and disfigurement are played down. Even when Goku loses a tooth in a more serious context, it's not portrayed as graphically and the tooth has almost entirely regrown itself by the very next page. It's stylistic, not literal. In this case, blood is pouring from Videl's face and jagged, broken teeth are visible. It's the same injury, but presented in a completely different way, a way that's far more relatable and far more evocative. While Spopovich is talked about as if he's this inhuman monster with bizarre powers, the majority of what he does is banal. It's brutal, but it's largely within the bounds of reality. So while it doesn't actually compare to some of the levels of violence the series has taken seriously, we react to it more strongly because it is so imitable. It is something we can reasonably fear. It's not entirely unique in this regard, though. I'd say that a twitching, glassy-eyed 5-year-old with a broken spine is at least equally gruesome and equally conceivable. So what else is there? Context is very important. For example, while I find the sheer brutality of Rikume's breaking of Gohan's neck to be more severe than, say, Frieza blowing up Cargo, I actually find Cargo's death more despicable, and that is because of the context. Aside from the fact that Cargo actually dies while Gohan is quickly restored to full health, there is a stark difference between these two characters. Gohan is incredibly strong, while Cargo is not. But more importantly, Gohan is a willing and active combatant who understands his situation and takes on those risks. Cargo is not. He's a helpless child who is murdered in cold blood. But complicating this discussion is the fact that context requires an adjustment of expectations when looked at through the lens of Dragon Ball because, as we've established, Dragon Ball is not reality. In reality, a 5-year-old, even an unnaturally strong one, cannot be expected to reasonably understand and consent to a bone-crushing mortal battle against an adult. The entire concept is ludicrous on its face. It's why you often see people debate the question, does Gohan have Stockholm Syndrome after being kidnapped by a demon and turned into a child soldier? It's valid to discuss, but it's complicated by how much reality you're willing to let through that lens. Gohan is certainly a child when the story needs him to be, but he's not a real child and is not constrained by all the realities of children. So if you look at them from a real-world context, the brutality suffered by Gohan and Cargo shouldn't be any different, but in the context of Dragon Ball's reality, they very much are. How does this tie into Videl's plight? Videl vs. Spopovich is framed as a match in a tournament. That is indeed a very different context than a battle for one's life or a battle to save the Earth. The spectators are naturally horrified at moving from a scene that looks like this to one that looks like this. But is that fair? How much of this comes down again to tone? If Elmer Fudd shoots Daffy Duck in the face and it causes his bill to spin around, it's funny. If Elmer Fudd shoots Daffy Duck in the face and Bugs Bunny is splattered with bits of his brain, it's not funny anymore. Whose fault is it that the outcome is different? Is it Elmer's? Is it the guns? Yep, that's right, guns don't kill people, sudden tonal shifts do. But the act is identical both times. Spopovich clearly enjoys inflicting pain, no question, but from a competitive perspective, what is Spopovich doing that is wrong? This is a fun, good-natured tournament, yes, but this isn't a protective pad-wearing, point-scoring tournament like the ones I participated in when I took martial arts. The Tenkaichi Budoukai has very few rules we know of, But what we do know is that one of the legitimate ways to win is to beat the opponent so severely they lose consciousness or at least so weakened they are unable to stand for a 10 count. Say what you will, but Spopovich is doing a very good job of achieving that goal. Personally, I'd say there should probably be a rule against lifting someone by the hair. Spopovich shouldn't be able to stand on her head when she's already down. That should be the start of a count, and I can't understand why there isn't one. Apparently, they aren't against the rules. Outside of that, he's not even doing anything that we haven't seen other tournament combatants do. Punching someone in the face is not against the rules. Had the Goku-Jackie Chun fight taken place in this darker, grittier dragon world we suddenly find ourselves in, Jackie would have had to navigate the majority of his fight while nursing a mangled, swollen nose rather than getting a cartoony spurt of blood that is instantly forgotten. Spopovich is punching and kicking. The normal things. I hate to hammer this in, but what Videl does is something we've never seen in a tournament. If she had been fighting someone else, this would have gone down in history as the time the champion's daughter horrifically murdered some poor random dude and possibly went to jail. And it's worth noting that she does this before Spopovich begins seriously hurting her. This can't even be justifiably labeled as a desperate act of self-defense. At this point, he's hit her twice. That doesn't justify Spopovich committing those 2 attacks that I think go way too far, but if we're talking about unjustifiable force, it's hard to deny she goes farther than he does. This moment really should occur after Spopovich has raised the stakes to a dangerous level. Returning to the context of a tournament as opposed to a battle, I have to again compare Gohan to Videl. I said that Gohan is an active combatant who chooses to be involved, but while in the Rikum situation, Gohan resolutely soldiers on until the end, it's not as if he can simply leave. Videl can. This is a tournament match. All she has to do is say she gives up and it's over. She is frequently encouraged to do so. She chooses not to. She knows what she's getting into and she determines the match is more important than her safety. That's a valid choice and hers to make. And before anybody brings it up, no, there is no moment in Toriyama's version wherein Spopovich physically restrains her from falling out of bounds. That's only in the animated adaptation, and quite frankly, I don't know if that's better or worse. What's better kind of depends on your perspective. It's obvious that Toriyama is trying to make this fight exceptionally brutal. My issue continues to be, though, that aside from a few outlying moments, the brutality is largely a result of the sudden imposition of a more realistic tone, rather than Spopovich doing things that are genuinely beyond the pale in the context of Dragon Ball. So, better in this context would mean including more elements that demonstrate that Spopovich is a sadist who is clearly prolonging the fight for his own enjoyment. I think the real heart of this issue is that Toriyama focuses on the wrong thing. He seems more preoccupied with showing off their brutality than he is in actually making Spopovich unreasonably cruel. This could have played better with less realistic depictions of violence if it focused more on Spopovich being a dirty fighter. Instead, the violence feels like a cheap workaround to achieve that end, just as Videl's death-dealing kick exists for the shock value of demonstrating that Spopovich is a freak, without considering how needlessly reckless that makes her appear. In both cases, the lack of a proper foundation causes the excessive violence to feel gratuitous. I'd argue that Spopovich preventing Videl from falling out of bounds on its own is a relatively non-violent act that is legitimately chilling and better sells Spopovich's brutality than Toriyama's use of graphic violence. Sure, the way the animated version combines that with a comparable level of violence while simultaneously stretching it out longer makes it even more uncomfortable, but as a substitute, it'd probably be much more effective. It plants the seed in my mind that Toriyama's decision to arbitrarily ramp up the realism of violence is because it's simpler and more immediately impactful than coming up with creative ways for Spopovich to prolong this fight without technically breaking the tournament rules. I already think that Spopovich standing on her head crosses a line, but it's not like this tournament seems to have many lines. Tenshinhan certainly suffers no retribution for breaking his opponent's leg after rendering him unconscious. Yet I never see anyone bring that up alongside this fight as far as tournament-based brutality goes. So, what's another difference? Okay, I've put this off long enough. I'd argue a major reason this makes people uncomfortable is found in Gohan's incredibly patronizing line here. He's not the kind of opponent who will go easy on you just because you're a girl. Sex is definitely a factor in the brutality of this fight. In a sweeping and obvious generalization, men are usually, on average, physically stronger than women. There is a disgusting and ongoing history of men leveraging that strength against women to the point that polite society teaches everyone from childhood that males should never hit females. It's ingrained so strongly that the idea of male-on-female violence in any context makes most people uncomfortable. And hey, that's certainly better than the alternative. This is a hugely important topic, an understandably sensitive topic, and it's a topic that both on its own and in the context of this narrative branches off into a variety of discussion topics, from how it affects men in abusive relationships who don't feel empowered to defend themselves, to debates over women in the military and active combat roles, to whether or not audiences find it palatable for women to be engaged in slapstick comedy. And those are all way outside of the scope of this video. Thankfully. But art does not exist in a vacuum. It is created within a culture and viewed through cultural lenses. For some people, it is difficult, if not impossible, to look at images like this and not be reminded of real-life examples of abuse, and that's a valid viewpoint to have. But like with the other aspects, I have to step back and examine this within the context of what Dragon Ball's reality allows and what this tournament allows. This is a competition with no weight classes. There is no division between the sexes. There are no medical exams. It's only a fairly recent change to separate kids from adults. The only qualifying traits to be on this stage are to punch a machine hard and to be above the age of 15. That's it. That is going to lead to the very real and precedented possibility of a man and a woman fighting each other. Transplanting this into the real world would be a much thornier and nuanced conversation. But in this context, I see no reason why this should be treated any differently from any other fight. After all, the last time we see a man in this tournament do as Gohan suggests, he immediately regrets it. Spopovich is certainly far more savage than he ought to be, but to suggest that he should be holding back solely because he's fighting a woman capable of easily breaking his neck, a woman who entered this competition for the explicit purpose of proving herself stronger than anybody else, is patently absurd and extraordinarily condescending. If Vegeta had managed to get the upper hand against artificial human number 18, would anyone really have encouraged him to hold back because he was fighting a woman? Even polite, respectful Trunks blows his version into itty bits. But I suppose that's the difference. Not even superpowered number 18 is ever allowed to suffer any visible damage. The fact of the matter is, Dragon Ball does not have many female combatants. This is the first time we've seen a woman suffer tangible injuries in a fight. The two other times we've seen female finalists in this tournament, they've been ejected quickly without much of a focus on stringent combat. But if we want female characters in Dragon Ball in major combat roles, there is an argument to be made that they should be expected to take the same lumps the men do. But, you might rightly argue back, does that mean they need to be tortured? Probably not. Modern Dragon Ball is a nearly bloodless affair, and Caulifla and Kale are two characters who do a great job acquitting themselves in the combat arena against some of the toughest male characters. So, hey, good job! I guess my issue is that if this is going to be considered well beyond the bounds of good taste, while doing the exact same thing to a young child is perfectly fine as long as the child is male, then I find myself a little bit sickened by that. One last aspect in which to analyze this comes down to its narrative function. In the immediate sense, its impact is pretty obvious. Spopovich and Yamu are bad guys. They are the reason Kaioshin and Kibito are here. There's a mystery around them, with their similar off-putting appearances, the M script on their foreheads. This is going to lead to something bigger. The idea of a character undergoing this transformation pays off down the line, and this is the first major indication that the heroes and the audience are supposed to be against them. It undeniably leaves that impression. It's the same reason why Ten Shinhan breaks Yamcha's leg. He is the bad guy. He takes the fight too far. He injures someone the other characters care about. In that case, Goku swears revenge. In this case, Gohan swears revenge. In the case of Goku, that ultimately results in his own match against Ten Shinhan, wherein those character threads are resolved, Ten Shinhan seeks absolution, and Yamcha forgives him. This story appears to be headed on the same track. If Gohan defeats Kibito in the next match, he will be paired against Spopovich and receive his opportunity for conflict resolution. However, that never plays out. I don't know if I think that's the wrong choice, though. Spopovich is ultimately not terribly important as a character, he will meet an appropriate end, and it's arguable whether or not he could be considered wholly responsible for his actions anyway. Either way, I feel that this scene accomplishes what it sets out to do, which is to establish these two as villains, and the threat is ultimately resolved. Even Gohan's role in all of this is paid off, and in a way I feel is stronger than conflict resolution. This event serves as the payoff to Gohan and Videl's growing relationship. Gohan rushes to her aid after she loses. Gohan takes her to safety. Gohan sets her mind at ease. It demonstrates a truly tender moment between them, and unlike the gag with Chi-Chi earlier on, Mr. Satan's protestations against them being in love finally feel earned rather than simply a decree on the part of the author. And unlike the "I want to cut my hair so Senpai will notice me" moment, Videl's smile here communicates such genuine affection between them that feels like a natural, in-character progression. The problem with it, though, is how this moment plays out in the long term. It caps the character arc between Gohan and Videl. Not long after this point, the series is going to complete its return from adventures of a high school superhero to extremely long sequences of battles to save the world. And in that shift, Videl is going to be demoted from major player to random background noise. It is most definitely a consequence of Toriyama pushing the series back to its status quo. Videl becomes a casualty of that decision and only a quarter of the way through her introductory storyline. There is certainly some logic to what happens. Videl is a good fighter, but she's not on the level to handle these threats. But since her growth has been a not insignificant part of the arc until now, it feels like this danger occurs simply to derail her development. In that context, her beating at the hands of Spopovich reads as a justification for sidelining her. She is, in effect, put in her place before the story continues on without her weighing it down. And that is not good. In some ways, Videl's fight against Spopovich cements exactly what I love about her character. She's not afraid to get dirty. She's not afraid to take hits. She's stubborn, resilient, resourceful, and refuses to give up. It proves that she's not like her father. She's not worried about her reputation. She doesn't compete in a tournament or fight crime to make herself look good. Those are the same traits that make me love Gohan, a character who likewise stands his ground against implacable foes. The difference is that when Gohan receives his lumps, at least up until now, the story more often allows him to dust himself off and continue on. When Videl takes her lumps, the story holds her back and tells her she's had enough, and doesn't let her fight again for the rest of the series. And in a cruel bit of irony, this is right after they put her in a shirt that literally has the word fight written on it. Her dramatic moment is less of a dramatic moment for her than it is for Gohan. It motivates him to get angry and be protective and swear revenge. There is a term in pop culture for that: women in refrigerators. It is named for an event in a 1994 Green Lantern comic wherein Kyle Rayner discovers his dead girlfriend stuffed in a refrigerator, so it actually barely postdates this event. But it simply serves as a name for a fairly common event in fiction wherein, disproportionately, a female character is severely wounded or killed not for her own story, but for the purpose of motivating a male hero. And on its face, this situation fits that description to a T. That said, I am surprisingly hesitant to affix that label to this. For one, as I've said, Gohan's so-called motivation here never really goes anywhere, but more importantly, unlike Dragon Ball's tendency to sideline active female characters into baby factories at the slightest provocation, this is not a problem that is exclusive to women. It's not even predominantly directed towards women. This might in fact be the only time it's ever applied to a woman. No, this is Toriyama's frequent problem of not knowing what he wants to do with characters and ultimately discarding them in unsatisfying ways or simply using them as punching bags to build up a threat. I wouldn't classify Yamcha as an example of woman in refrigerator, so while this event technically fits the criteria within the realm of fiction, it doesn't exist in a broader contextual framework or trend within its own series. It's bad in how it shuffles Videl to the sidelines, and in turn is bad for how it so callously discards one of its only female combatants, but, as faint praise as it is, I will defend the series against it hurting specifically women to motivate men. Dragon Ball has enough obvious issues with gender politics, so I feel no shame in granting it a mulligan on this one. So, that's the Videl vs. Spopovich fight. I don't know if I ever imagined I'd have this much to say about one tournament match, but it's obvious that it's bigger than simply the art on the page. I hope I've been able to encapsulate the many functions it serves, ideas it invigorates, and emotions it generates. While it doesn't make me uncomfortable to read, I can totally understand why it evokes that feeling in others. Like so many topics that encourage thought, it's going to generate many different, complex, and opposing reactions, and that's probably for the best. Thanks for watching. This ended up being another long one. This channel is able to do what it does through your support, so please donate to Patreon if you can. At the very least, let me know what you think. A topic this big doesn't live and die solely by my voice, so make yours heard. See you next time!